Hi everyone, how are you doing? I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader. How has your reading year been so far? We're at that halfway point, and before I started making this video, I was gonna go count up how many books I've read so far this year, because this is the time of year where we're all checking in with our progress and our reading goals. But then I thought, numbers really don't matter. I just read whenever I have time, and that's good enough. That's enough. And I have read some truly extraordinary books so far this year, so I'm going to share my top 10 with you. But I know there are books that I've missed out on and that I've been wanting to get to, so I'd really like to know some of the best books you've read so far this year. So let me know in the comments below. Leave me some good suggestions. Right, so first off, a funny thing that seems to have happened this year is I seem to be reading a lot of memoirs, or at least more memoirs than I normally read, because I don't normally read memoirs. But some of these aren't strictly memoirs. They sort of are part memoir, part something else. You'll see what I mean. So first off is a book I read at the very start of the year, which is Susan Orlean's book, the library book. And this is it's not really a memoir, but it does draw into Orlean's own experience when she was growing up and her connection with libraries. It's more a piece of journalistic nonfiction where Orlean is considering the case of the fire in Los Angeles Central Library in 1986, which was absolutely horrendous. It destroyed so many books and pieces of literature. And she considers the case of this fire and the history of this library and the very curious man that was strongly suspected of starting this fire. But it's also more just a sort of ode to libraries in general and looking at their history and their connection, the way they connect communities with each other, and about some specific libraries and librarians. And this is a real book lover's book. And it worked. It worked. I absolutely loved it. Where Reasons End by Yiyun Li. This is a novel, but it draws heavily upon Li's own experiences because the author's son sadly committed suicide. So the novel is an imagined conversation between a mother and a son after the son has committed suicide. That sounds incredibly depressing, and reading it is a very intense experience, but the way their conversation plays out is very touching because whenever the mother's thoughts become too lofty, the son sort of reels her in and brings her back to reality. So it's alternately playful and profound how it considers language and memory and life and grief, and it's just a very moving, beautifully written book. Next is a straightforward memoir, Kill the Black One First by Michael Fuller. Now that's a very startling title, and it's meant to be, because this was something that was shouted out from an angry crowd when Michael Fuller was standing in a line of policemen during the Brixton riots in 1981. Now this was an infamous confrontation between members of a predominantly black community and the police force. And at the time, Michael Fuller was one of the only black policemen in London, so he found himself caught in the middle of this when he heard this shouted from the crowd, and he knew it was aimed at him. So the memoir explores Michael Fuller's life as a black man who is dedicated to police work. He was one of the first black chief constables in England, and he did a lot of work to try to bridge the gap in England's racially divided society at that time and over the years. And it's such an inspiring and uplifting story, and it's just wonderful to read about somebody who is, a truly good man trying to do good work. And I found it so inspiring. You Will Be Safe Here by Damian Barr. This is a novel set in South Africa in two parts, which are sort of bridged together. So the first part concerns Susan, who is a woman that is forcibly taken to a British concentration camp during the Second Boer Wars in 1901 after the British Army have burned her farm. And yes, this is something that the British actually did. They ran multiple concentration camps during this war. And the second part concerns Willem, who is a teenage boy taken to a very sinister training camp by his parents in an effort to make him more masculine. And Willem just wants to be left alone and read his books. But it's set during the present day, and it's based on actual training camps, which are meant to toughen boys up and make men out of them. So it very poignantly brings together these two stories about institutions and camps which on the surface are meant to protect people and nurture them, but actually destroy their identities and their lives. And it's just an incredibly powerful novel. Constellations by Sinead Gleeson. We're back to memoirs, and this is a book of autobiographical essays which follow the trajectory of Gleeson's life from her girlhood in Ireland when she was beset by multiple medical difficulties, and her journey to becoming a feminist, a wife, a mother, a writer. And the way Gleeson writes about illness is so poignant. She draws upon a lot of references from art and literature to reflect about her condition and life in general. And this book just floored me. It's so beautifully done. And look at the cover, which is just gorgeous. Next is a sort of memoir. It was published as a novel in the original French version, but then the English translation, it was published as a memoir, but then it was submitted as a novel to the Man Booker International Prize, and it was shortlisted for that prize, and that prize only accepts novels as submissions. So The Years by Annie Ernaux. And you guys, I've been gushing about this book so much. It's an incredible look at the past several decades of France through one woman's eyes, but it's narrated from this really unique collective voice which captures the mood and sensibility of a whole community. It's inventive and moving and profound, and I mean, it's essentially a woman looking through a photo album, but it captures a whole society. It's amazing. The Doll Factory by Elizabeth Macneal, and this is a historical novel which is so clever and gripping. I was gripped all the way throughout reading this novel. So it's about a woman in mid-1800s London who has a very laborious job making dolls, but she aspires to become an artist, and she agrees to become an artist's model as long as he gives her lessons. And it's also about a man who becomes infatuated with her. And it's also about the artist's pet wombat. And if you don't know about wombats, these gorgeous marsupials, go look up on YouTube wombats because they are the most beautiful creature ever. They're my favorite animal. But this novel is truly excellent in how it considers art and obsession and history. The Heavens by Sandra Newman. Now this is touted as the year's most mind-expanding love story, but it truly is that. So it begins as a normal modern-day love story set in New York where Kate and Ben meet at a party, but Kate has very vivid dreams where she slips into the past and into the life of a real-life historical figure, Amelia Lanier, who was an Elizabethan poet believed to be the dark lady that inspired Shakespeare's sonnets and poetry. But in these dreams, Kate is able to alter history. It's honestly so wild, but it makes you think about destiny and ambition and the meaning of reality. It's honestly unlike anything I've read before. This Brutal House by Niven Govinden. This is a novel I just read recently, and it concerns the story of a group of drag house mothers who sit in silent protest in front of New York City's City Hall. And for years, children from these drag houses have gone missing. So after repeated indifference and harassment from authorities, these mothers feel like they are past words. But it is also the story of Teddy, who's a child from these drag houses and now works in City Hall. So he's very much caught between these two very different worlds. Niven invokes the feeling and spirit of drag balls in this beautiful novel. So it is funny and poignant, and yes, it is fierce. And finally, here's a book that I just finished reading yesterday, and I feel kind of nervous putting on a list of my favorite books, a book that I only just finished, but I found it so powerful. And it's a book of poetry, and I don't often read poetry, but I know I could go back and reread all of these poems because there is so much more there. It's Surge by Jay Bernard, and Jay spent a lot of time in an archive researching the 1981 New Cross fire, and this was also dubbed the New Cross Massacre because it was a fire that occurred in the early hours of a morning during a teenage girl's birthday party. And 13 young people were killed in this fire, and 27 others were injured. And a lot of people believed that this was a racist attack. But the authorities who investigated it handled it horribly, and the case wasn't resolved. But there was a lot of outcry and protest from the Black community, and it was one of the incidents that actually and started the Brixton riots, which I talked about in this earlier memoir. Now, this is a complex subject, but Jay handles it very artfully, considering the weight of history in these poems and how we memorialize people from the past who have been forgotten or whose voices can never be known. Some of these poems are also very personal, reflecting on gender and sexuality, nationality, and racial identity. And so, like I said, I don't often read poetry, but I found these so impactful, and I loved this book. So those are all the books I want to talk about. You'll notice that I haven't talked about Marlon James' novel, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and that's because I read it at the end of last year, and I made a whole video gushing about how much I loved this novel. And since it's been published, there's been a lot of mixed reactions to it, but this was a novel that was so hyped. I mean, I feel like any novel that's hyped this much, inevitably there's a lot of criticism that comes out about it. And I'm not doubting the sincerity of people who felt a bit disappointed by it, but it's a novel that I loved reading so much, and I actually want to read it again before the next installment of the series comes out. So let me know what you think of any of these books, if you've read any of them or if you're interested in reading them now. If you want to know more of my thoughts about them, I'll put links below to my full reviews of the books. But also, like I said, let me know if you have any suggestions and the best books that you've read this year. Let me know those in the comments below, because I always enjoy getting recommendations. But thank you for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now.